Well, everybody is very welcome to be here. I'm privileged to facilitate this discussion. I want to say, firstly, that I was very moved by the video, and I want to applaud the courage of everyone who participated in it. I want to particularly thank the Treaty Generation and the Descendants group. The participants have already been well introduced to you now, so they require no further introduction. I just wanted to add a very short contribution, not in my words, but to something that nearly all the speakers have referred to, is the dialogue that is occurring. And Pat has said the function of Glencree is to hold the space for dialogue, to hold a safe space for dialogue. But here are the words on a Spanish documentary called La Pelota Vasca, the words of Father Alec Reid, who was a major participant in the peace process and a true expert in dialogue. And he said, a dialogue is the only dynamic, the only democratic dynamic for democratic conflict resolution. You know that there is something in your enemy's or opponent's position which is true, because that's where you link in. If he or she says something which is true, you say, okay, that's true, I agree with that. And then you have the beginning of a relationship, and you have the beginning of an agreement. And two takeaways from that are that it's a dynamic. Dialogue is energy. It starts something. And the other takeaway is the powerful effect of speaking and listening to the truth. So you're engaged in something which is powerful. Everyone in this room is engaged in it. So I was going to ask our speakers, had they anything to add briefly to what they've said in the video, and then to open up the discussion to the room so you all can contribute to the dialogue if you feel it appropriate to do so. It's a generous thing to do. The video has moved me. It has caused me to think about my mother's family, which had its complexities during the Civil War. It starts a train of thought. So let's commence the dialogue with our speakers here, and I'll ask Bernard first of all to kick off, if I may.
Well, thank you very much, Turlough. All I really wanted to say, I mean, there's an hour and a half video, as Rónán has said. I'd just like to thank, first of all, Rónán and Wally for putting that together. They spent a lot of time editing out an hour and a half to produce this particular movie. That's the first thing I just wanted to say. And the second thing is, I have family. I have a brother and cousins in this room, and I'm sure some of them are saying, I've never heard any of this. And it must be coming as a bit of a strange to them. And that is because we just, unlike a whole lot of others, our family stayed. We threw our lot in with the new state and made the best of it. And I have no doubt that my nephews and nieces, my own children, they consider themselves completely Irish and part of our nation. And you might wonder, say, well, why did you speak out? I mean, what was the point in coming out from under the rock and actually saying, well, actually, there is another identity? And it is all to do, and the only reason I did it was partly, well, there are two reasons. One, to be partly true to myself, and the other is about the future. It's about the future. It's not about the past. When I sat down at a table with the Descendants group, with the descendants of Michael Collins, Harry Boland, Cal Brewer, I basically said to myself, anything is possible. This generation are able to sit down and work together, produce that book. 25 years ago, I was out hunting in Scotland, and I became quite friendly with the Scot. And he was completely mesmerised about, we had that was the big troubles in those times, and he asked me about what was happening in Ireland, and that conversation ensued. He said to me when he listened to everything I had to say, as he was trying to find out the differences, an explanation as to why all this fighting was going on, he listened, and there was a pause, and then he said to me, he said, "That's funny," he said, "you know something," he said, "you know, there's a big movement in Scotland," he said, "to gain independence." And I said, "Yes, I was aware of that." And he said, "Well, it seems to me that you're a long way behind us." And I said, how do you make that out? We've had independence since 1922. He said, "No," he said, "you've still got problems in the north in particular." And he said, "You know," he said, "I'm a staunch unionist. You're shooting on my estate here, but if you look up at the flag that's flying from the tower of my chateau, or not my chateau, my castle, what is it?" And I said, it's the Saltaire." And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "I have nothing, probably, politically in common with the men and women of Glasgow Govern." He said, "But if you go down the streets of Glasgow Govern, which I know," he said, "you'll see the Saltaire in the window. They are Scots Nats. I'm a Scottish nationalist, unionist. We are agreed on one thing. We're all Scottish. We're all Scots." And I knew the point he was making was that the minority on this island, the unionist minority, do not consider themselves to be Irish, because we have evolved in such a way that Irish actually excludes them. And it seems to me that what we have to do is engage in a dialogue which would help people of a unionist persuasion, an identity, a unionist, to consider themselves Irish. They are Irish. But how do they come to feel that Irish and the definition of Ireland, and it embraces all our cultures, all our beliefs, all our identities? That's what this is all about. I think polls on the border and everything is a complete distraction until we learn to live with one another and give effect to the concept which lies at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement: parity of esteem. And where is the parity of esteem in Ireland, in this part of the island? So many people believe it's something that goes on in Northern Ireland. I like to think that if we had reached the point where there was genuine respect for the different identities on this island, the programme I heard yesterday on RTE would not have been broadcast, where the journalists scoffed and mocked. They passed one another out to scoff and mock the coronation. It was quite shocking. We've a long way to go, and I actually believe myself that if we had a shared island, and the government have this initiative towards a shared island, that programme would not, or the journalists on that programme, if they were broadcasting to a million people who had a different identity, those comments would not have been made. Or if they were made, they'd be made with a lot more balance. So I don't blame those people. I think they just actually are just not consciously aware of the fact that we share an island off the west coast of Europe which has two identities on it. So my whole involvement in this is all about peace and reconciliation and an understanding and awareness that we have two identities on this island, and that the future, whatever it may be, and it may be after my time, is going to be shared. And sharing has to, can only come about by giving practical effect to the concepts that underline the Good Friday Agreement.
Rónán, would you like to say a few words before I pass the microphone to Richard and Ida?
Yeah, thanks. I'm keen to get the audience involved as well, because I'd say a few things. I just wonder how you felt listening to that film, because It's in the emotion that we actually begin to heal. I've learned that as a doctor, and I see one of my colleagues, Conor Keane, with me here today. I spent a lot of my career trying to pull people together to have conversations about the medical firmament and universe. And when you get people around a table and talking and listening, everything becomes possible. And so I'm a firm believer in this. The one thing medically, I suppose, to share with you is that in the last 25 years, we've developed in the medical community a sense of the source of most illness, which is trauma and childhood attachments and behavioral theory. And we now have epigenetics, which gives us a model of how transgenerational trauma comes from an original generation and is passed to the next. So we're carrying a burden, but it's also an opportunity, because I think in the next 25 years of medicine, they're going to look back and say, it's so obvious that trauma causes all these medical things. Why were you blinkered, you know? So I think that's important. And I suppose trauma hides in shame and it hides in silence. And that's what happened to, I think, from a medical perspective. It hid in the silence and the shame. And we got out of that not by politics or politically winning an argument, but by just telling human stories. I'm profoundly moved by the human stories on that video. But I've had 40 years of medical practice as a GP listening to people's stories, and I know that when they tell their story, something happens. There's something really happens when somebody is trusted, like myself, someone shares that story. It's the beginning of healing. Yes, we give them the antidepressants. Yes, we give them the anxiolytics. But actually, the therapy is in the talking, in the dialogue, in the trust, in the respect. And I like Pat's idea about the necessity for dialogue, that dialogue is the therapy. So we're on a journey. I think we're 100 years after the treaty and the Civil War, which really wounded us. But we're 200 years after Vinegar Hill in 1798. And we've much to learn from Ida, and we've much to learn from our Protestant brothers and sisters, our friends. We need to share the island equally and with total respect for each other's culture, and not diminish it, devalue it, discard it, the way we've done. So that's me.
Thank you very much.
You should never give a Dubliner a microphone because he forgets to give it back.
I'll hand the microphone now to Richard.
Oh, you're very kind. How do I take it? You asked a question, what do I add? I don't think I'd add much to what we talked about on the day. I'm not really sure how my family would have felt about all the things I said, and I'm not sure they'd all agree with me in terms of my perception. I was the youngest boy in my family, and I grew up surrounded by my father's. No, not at all. Okay, sorry about that, Carol. So, I'm not sure all of my family members would agree with my experience as a child. I grew up in a family where my father was a judge, and he went to the special criminal court. So, for a good part of our childhood, we had quite a lot of security, which was odd in a small farming village out in the middle of the country. So, we didn't really have much education either, because we were taught at home, and I really didn't have a very formal education, and I wasn't drenched in Catholicism or any of that, even though my mother had signed up to me being brought up as a Catholic. So we had a fairly bizarre existence. We'd go to church, but we come back very quickly. I wouldn't really add much to what I said on the day. The one thing that does worry me is that we should be moving forward, not reflecting too much on the past. And if we want if we want respect as individuals and we want respect as communities, we have to respect the other individuals and the other communities. We have difficult things to do. There should be no predefined outcomes to a greater Ireland. Ireland should be a greater place to be for everybody. And, you know, it could be a platitude, or seen as a platitude, but ultimately, if people can have the economic and progression that they need to survive, you know, most of the obstacles we put in place in our lives to our understanding of others sort of melt away. You know, if we are able to have a future that is good for us and good for our children, what does it matter where we come from and how we got here? The gentleman I talk about in the video, George Bernard O'Connor, he was a member of the Royal Historical Society. He was a fellow of the Historical Society. He wrote 3 books. He wrote a book on Elizabethan Ireland, and he wrote it from an Irish perspective, not from a glib perspective. He wrote a book about Stuart Ireland, because you have to do that if you're going to write a book about a Protestant Ireland, because there was a period where it was a Stuart Ireland. And then he wrote a book a year before he died, which was about setting the context for his fellow Irishmen. And that book is you can't find it, buy it anywhere. It's a small little book, and it might have been his death sentence, because he makes free commentary about republicanism, not in a negative way, not in a positive way, but in a cautious way. He makes commentary about the Anglo-Saxon myth. England isn't all Anglo-Saxon, and what we experience and we believe as being the edifice and the position of Britain is not true. They're just as mingled as we are. We're in a highly mingled nation. Every element of our character comes from that mix, and he called it out a year before he was assassinated.
Thank you for that. And could I ask Ida to say a few words? And before you do, thank you for saying that you experienced countless examples of kindness in times of stress. That really resonated with me, and Richard's emotion really registered with me as well, and what Bernard had said that I hadn't known as seeing him, and what Bishop Paul Coulson had said. But thank you very much for drawing our attention to that even in the midst of conflict, there can be many acts of human kindness.
Yes, and I think this is something that we as historians have to be very conscious of too, to do that, there are 2 or many sides to any story. If it involves humans, there are going to be. And too often we focus on the killings or the difficult incidents, and not enough. And maybe that's because we like to keep our head down as Protestants. That's one thing. Even when I was doing that book, my family was saying, no, you really should keep your head down. Don't talk about us. And I said, no, now is the time we have to talk. But we have to do it in a sensitive way. And I really wanted to make that point, because we've neighbours who've minded us for generations, households where we could, as kids, freely walk into and get a duck egg boiled for us. How could you possibly say there was antagonism there, And we need to recognise that. And I think one of the things I've become more conscious of recently, that I'm doing something right with this, is that there are certain sections in Northern society weaponising certain incidents that have always been regarded as flashpoints, like the Tilson case, or the Mayor Librarian, or whatever, or West Cork, and that we need to counter these stories with stories of integration as well. And I think my own father's life work was really to do that as part of his own historical research. But just to move to the oral history side of it, Rónán, I'm very struck by what you saw about the talk about the dialogue, and it's been a real privilege. Sometimes I get goosebumps listening to what you're all saying, and to be involved and to be an onlooker and to see. And I'm an oral historian who deals with many different forms of trauma. I've interviewed in mother and baby homes. I've interviewed on the lifelong impact of the 1918-19 pandemic on people, and lots of other traumatic situations as well. And the one thing that comes across to me is the talk and listening. And the ability to listen when it's sensitively done is really rewarding, just even in the context of the room, even without talking about further use or you know, a historical writing or treatment at all. You know, that in some way helps to shape a story and to understand why you feel this deep unsettlement about things. You know, why, you know, the treaty families felt this deep unsettlement about things, and we needed to have these conversations, which Rónán and the rest of the group have so carefully curated and steered. But I think we need to keep having those conversations.
You believe now is the time to talk?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think many people believe now is the time to talk. So are there any people in the audience who would like to ask a question of the panel, or say something, or how they were moved by this, or do you agree that, yes, I'll take this? And if you would like to introduce yourself, would you like to come up?
No, Rita Cosgrave's my name. I resonate very much with all of you because I had an English grandfather. He was Bernard's grandfather, my grandfather, and he was English.
Yeah.
But my grandfather on my dad's side was Irish. He was W.T. Cosgrave. He was a rebel in 1916. He started the state. And it's a huge, my whole life, a huge problem with people. If I'm abroad, it's, oh, Ireland, you hate the English. And I'm going, me? I said, I don't hate the English. I have an English grandfather, I'm incredibly proud of him. You know, he was in the First World War. But I have to say, at times, I can't talk about it. And in other times in Ireland, I can't talk about who I am. Because of the 77. I was supposed to go to a historical society last week, and it was so contentious, I actually started to shake it. Can't do it. Because people think, and he did, he signed, he was head of state, and he signed that 77 be killed, but they brought in a law, and the law was no guns. You know, you're a new state, and you see your own colleagues being shot the same day. So I have a huge empathy with you all, and I'm delighted we're talking about it.
And thank you. Well, Rita, thank you very much for your contribution. And these are immensely valuable acts of generosity to us all to hear the voice of someone like Rita. Would anyone else like to say a few words, or is anybody moved to say anything? Or yes. You're Bernard's brother, I know. Philip Barton.
It's been very revealing and, I must say, touching and really, really good and important to actually, you know, learn what we're learning 100 years later. In my professional life, my 47 years, early on in my life, I learned quite quickly, this is now from a business perspective, that it's important to look at the past to understand history. I'm talking really in a business environment, in terms of helping me to formulate how can I be a better person, a better businessman, how do I go forward. I think, Richard, you said, I think, you know, the importance of the future, and Bernard even references it as well. And I suppose this is hugely important in the learning in that, but I just like to understand maybe the views of perhaps one or two of the panel, that what are those tangible next steps that we can take? This is a start, and it's the learning in that. Well, I'm sort of thinking of the next generation. I think of my kids, and how do I make this relevant for them? How do we influence them? Because they're the decision makers for the future. They're the future. You know, we're still here, and we have a part to play. But I'm just interested, the tangible steps. What's the next stage in this process? How can we actually help educate the next generation to learn? I mean, I remember in school, history stopped in 1895 or something. You know? I came out of school at 18 and I hardly knew anything about the War of Independence, the 19th Rising, etc., the Civil War. We knew nothing. So I'm just, you know, I'm very much focused about, the future. What are those tangible steps?
Well, yeah, we'll put that to the panel. Would anyone like to take that question? tangible steps for the future?
For me, it really is about, we must talk about it. We must talk about it, and we should be found, grounded in fact. But fact has different perception to different communities and different, an event. The fact that people celebrate the Battle of the Boyne, which was a civil war, another civil war on the island, people are entitled to their history, and they're entitled to celebrate it in the way they want. But it shouldn't be to the detriment of others. If everybody is in a place of mutual opportunity, then why? That is the thing, isn't it? It's when we deny people freedom, freedom of expression, and we put a rope around it, and we say that's that, and that's where it is. We just have to talk about it and be grounded in fact, and accept perceptions are people's perceptions, and it's their reality. And it's not a bad thing, it's just the way it is. And we have to move forward on the basis of economic success and opportunities for all. That's what's important for a greater Ireland.
Yeah.
Could I just have a quick
Ida?
Thank you. It's when we look at people, whether we pass somebody by in the street or whatever, we're making little stories in our head about them, aren't we? Yeah. We look at them when we think about them. If we're given a few more facts about them, Protestant, Catholic, whatever, Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, we make a bigger story about them based on what we know. And I think these stories show how confounding the real stories can actually be. And that we need to be open to looking at our own bias and to examining it and to teach those about us, or to encourage those about us to do the same thing. And this is something I do with my students. I'm a third level lecturer, and I'm constantly saying to them, examine who you are, examine who you think you are. And I say the very first thing I do as a historian every morning is scrub my bias off my back, or try to, or at least expose it to myself, and to try and do that. And we need to do that in order to move forward. And it's not just about talking, it's also about listening.
Very much so, yeah. Bernard, would you like to?
Just to come in on that, there's something very powerful about when you hear someone telling you their truth.
Yeah.
And, you shared, Bernard and Richard and Ida, your truth. And we need to listen to that and get comfortable to listening to people's stories. We did, and this is not to explain or to excuse it, but to explain, we did have almost 100 years post-state certainly 80 years post-state we weren't living in a democracy, we were living in a theocracy. And we were encouraged in certain Catholic traditions, which had value, but also were shame-based and silence-based. You were not encouraged to stand up and speak out. And we're letting go. We're letting go of that, and we're beginning to stand up and speak out. And I think these stories are really important because they're true. They're true for Richard. They're true for Bernard. And we have that rich diversity within ourselves. Yes, I'm looking at Carl Brewer, and I'm thinking, and I'm looking at Michael O'Mahony. We did terrible things to each other. We did things we are very ashamed about and we didn't talk about. But we have Descendants sitting here today in a room, listening to each other. That's pretty powerful. And I think that sets a standard and sets the goalposts of having honest conversations going forward.
Yeah. Bernard?
No, just to reiterate, I think that's absolutely, it's 100% correct. That's the way to go. And actually, this is the first time now since we started all this. None of this would have happened, by the way, without the Fawsitts. The Fawsitts at the beginning. Carol Fawsitt was down there. None of this would have happened without them. Their grandfather played a pivotal role in the foundation of our state, and he was forgotten, pretty well forgotten. So fair dues to them for saying he's not going to be forgotten. We're going to remember him, and that led in then to contacting other people. And in this room today, we have the descendants of Cal Brewer, Michael Collins, and W.T. Cosgrave.
Yeah.
They're all sitting in this room together, and Harry Boland. you know, when you think of what happened 100 years ago, and here we are, and that comes back to my brother's question. You know, how do we go forward to this? This is a start. It's a good start. I think it's a good start anyway. And Philip, I think the answer to the question is the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. All of this today and the other day is all going on a website. And disseminating this to the younger generation is absolutely essential. You're spot on. We're not going to make it. We're not going to be able to move forward unless the next generation are treated to the information that this is possible. And so I think the websites are going to be, the permanent movies are going to be there on this. And yeah, it can't stop here. It has to start here. I'm going to finish on one thing, Turlough. The Irish Rugby Football Union is signalling a way forward for us in a mega way, in a macro way. It's an all-Ireland organisation, as you know. It refused to accept the split, the partition. And I've often heard people, I hate that goddamn song, that, you know. Yeah, who dreamt up that song? Phil Coulter actually wrote the song. He was commissioned to do it by I don't know if anybody is aware, have seen the Irish rugby football team playing. And the unionist members of that team are mute when it comes to Rónán. And they're mute for a good reason. If you read it in English, there's no way they could sing it. And so the Irish Rugby Football Union knew that we had to find something in common. So we all know lots and lots of people, unionist people, come from the north to support the Irish Rugby Football Union because they made rugby a game which we're all, that's Ireland meaning us all. And Ireland's call is about that. And so it'll be lots of things like that. Little things, they're all step, but it's little things sharing that, like that, which is going to be so important.
There are two questions on the floor. I'll take those very quickly, and then I'll come to Rónán, and I'll hand over to Pat immediately. We're running short of time, so if you could say what you're moved to say. Yeah, this is
Tadhg Crowley. I'm a Harry Boland. So I'd like to briefly try and answer Bernard's brother's question, because I related so well to everything that was said in Glencree, and it was a very memorable afternoon.
Yeah.
I actually have to disagree with what Bernard said here today about two identities in this Ireland. There's way more than two identities in this island, and that's a mistake I think we make. So, you know, it's a plurality of identities that will help us to solve problems. So I think the answer is actually the people who aren't here today, which is young people, because they don't see things in a binary way, be it left or right, British or Irish, male or female. And I think it's that kind of spectrum of opinion where we can all have an opinion. We don't all have to agree, but creating that safe spectrum where we can be a multitude of things at different times. And I think young people understand how to do that, because you don't have to be one thing or the other. You can be multiple things at the same time. Don't know if that
Thanks for that. Carol Fawsitt.
Thank you, thanks, Tadhg. I just wanted to come in on what TJ and Tadhg said there, because I think the way forward is with small steps. It's spreading out the stories, the information, whatever. But what about our schools?
Yeah.
I remember history stopped in 1922. Knew nothing about any civil war, anything at all. And I think history has to stop being written by historians from the conqueror. History is so complex, and if we're going to keep our young children and our students coming up aware of the past, we must learn from our past. We still don't. Our history has to be compulsory, and it has to be accessible, and it has to be multifaceted. That's all. Food for thought.
we need to learn history also from a conflict resolution point of view. For I would be very interested to study the reasons why Dev's voice was not heard when the Anglo-Irish Treaty was being negotiated. Now, I know that there are different views on that. I take no view on that. But to people who are involved in conflict resolution, the absence of an important voice is a very jarring thing to hear. You lose the influence over the process, and you lose the influence the process might have had on you. So I agree that we need to learn history in a deep way, and I think that's a point, Carol, that many people would agree with. Just very briefly, because we're running out of time.
My name is Tim O'Connor, and I'm privileged to be the beneficiary of a lot of people here. I've worked for nearly 40 years for the Irish state. I was working in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and I joined the civil service in the early 1970s. So I just, as a citizen, just say thanks to the founding generation, because I had a very good life. I was born in 1952, so I was part of the generation that had a very good life working for the state. I also have connections here to some of the people, as they all know themselves. I was Consul General of Ireland in New York, and one of my predecessors representing the nascent state, of course, was Tadhg's granduncle, Harry Boland. So that's one connection, and I was very honoured to meet up with Tadhg a few years ago and start connecting him in. And then I met Rónán along the way and discovered that his grandfather and Richard's grandfather, of course, was also, I had a very strong fellow feeling with them, and I was very privileged to introduce Rónán to Pat Hynes a few years ago and get that going. But I was also part of the Irish government delegation in 1998, 25 years ago. So I'm a kind of just a little bit of, so when I hear all of these stories, and I'm privileged now to work with Pat Hynes and Neil and Terry and everybody in Glencree in terms of what we can do, and I hope Ted won't mind me. There is somebody from the current generation right here in the room as well working with Leo Varad with the Taoiseach. So because the same issues, and I'll finish on this, you're asking what the future is. I'm still involved. I'm the Irish government representative on a commission for paramilitarism in the north. Unfortunately, it's still a necessary thing, so I'm still on the pitch in a little bit of way. And I suppose what Pat Hynes and myself talk about nearly most days is that the essence of the Good Friday Agreement 25 years ago was everything you guys have been talking about today. And I want to thank you for this initiative. This is brilliant, and my shout out to my colleague Wally Young, who I worked in the Oris with Wally. What you've done, because you're actually capturing the fundamental piece here, which is accommodation. That was the essence of the Good Friday Agreement, which is diverging views, and that the only pathway forward, you set aside the gun, it never appears again in Irish history, ever, 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 and then we focus on accommodation of difference. And your conversations about, and I really appreciate what the guys who said, what Bernard and Richard were saying there, and I as well, that this has to be about the future. And the future, I know for certain, is only going to be forged through accommodation and dialogue. And the last, I leave with a quote from Theodore Zeldin, is an Oxford academic and still alive at 89, God bless him. And he has a wonderful insight which says that never begin a conversation that you are not prepared to be changed by.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that contribution, and thank you for all your service to the cause of peace, and thank the diplomatic corps who made such a contribution. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over the microphone to Rónán for a few words, and he'll hand then to Pat to close the meeting. Just one piece of housekeeping. My father wasn't the Lord Chief Justice, he was a Lord Justice of Appeal, but they were troubled times. Yeah, there was, yeah. Yeah, he wasn't the first Catholic either. Yeah.
I just listening to all that, I just want to close from my own point of view and our groups to say big thank you to Glencree, to Naoimh, to Pat, Terry, for working with us for nearly 3 years now. And I think it's clear, and from Tim's contribution, this work is important. And it doesn't really matter how many people are in the room, it's the message that we bring back. And I'm very struck by the fact that the recent interview, the Silent Civil War, was founded around the conversation that happened one-to-one between a researcher 50 years ago, Strauss, and the senior people. And in a way, that's a bridge to the previous generation. So today, by our conversations and our presence, but particularly the dialogue, we are leaving a legacy for the next generation and those that follow. And I'm really delighted to say that Glencree has been a very positive protector for us and for this kind of dialogue, because it makes us very safe to continue it. And thank you.
So thank you all very much for continuing with us. Maybe some concluding remarks. It should be remembered that this is the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. It's also the month and the 100th anniversary of the ending of that civil war, May 1923. So we share these two anniversaries in this same year. And as my friend Tim O'Connor alluded to, one of the things that we regularly say to friends and colleagues in Northern Ireland from the Unionist community and across the water is that we'll have to learn to live with fuzzy edges at the extremity of our aspiration around identity and who we are, because there's no hard edges to any of this. We share these islands, and we share this island with those who are different from us. And in a sense, what was done 25 years ago was to bring to a conclusion the legitimacy for any use of violence in resolving disputes around the identities that occupy these two spaces. And I think that as we reflect with these wonderful people and the generation who built the state and founded the state in very difficult circumstances, the challenge going forward, as Rónán alluded to earlier, is within and among the principles contained in that Good Friday Belfast Agreement. The balance of union and unity in one moment, both valid traditions, both valid aspirations, and both deserving of respect from whichever quarter you come. And in that context, accepting those two identities and those two aspirations, to discover then what is the nature of the conversation, what's the nature of the dialogue that we need to have that produces an outcome, as Seamus Mallon said, that leads us to a shared home place where there's never a need ever again to take out a gun or hide a gun for a future date, because we won't be needing them. So my thanks to our panel, to each and every one of them, to each and every one of you for coming and participating and watching the film. A safe home to you all, and thank you very much. We hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.